A group of kindergartners arrived home after their very first day of school. They each carried with them a note from their teacher that simply read, "Dear parents, if you promise not to believe everything your child says happens at school, I will promise not to believe everything they say happens at home." Now, we've already heard a little bit about promises this morning, right? Girl Scouts came up here and they recited their promise. We sang about promises with Standing on the Promises, a hymn I can remember my dad singing to me as he tried, usually unsuccessfully, to get me to fall asleep. Our video in Little Saints time was Noah and his ark and the flood, and Macy, Bree, Pandora, and Ari. They read that story, the end of that story, for us this morning. It talks about the fact that God makes promises to us too. And actually, this is just one of the first of many promises that God makes to us. And God has indeed made many promises to us. If we wanted to cover them all, we'd probably be here all day. Don't worry, I'm not going to cover them all. But we are going to talk about 5 of the big ones. And we'll end with God's greatest promise of all. So first, we have Noah. And here's our first test. So for God's first promise of the day, God tells us, let's try that again. Ready? That's better. He tells us, I promise that what I did with the flood, I will never do again. Humanity had gotten so bad that God thought it may have been a mistake to even start this creation thing in the first place. So he decides to save Noah and his family, who are the last righteous people on earth, along with 2 of every kind of animal, and start over again. For us today, his promise means that we don't have to worry about this type of thing again. When we believe in a God as powerful as this, a God that can actually wipe away creation, we could spend our lives paralyzed in fear of total destruction. And I don't know, maybe in some ways that might make us behave a little bit more. But God doesn't do that. Instead, God tells us that he loves his creation so much that this is out of the question a second time. No matter what, the people and all living creatures on earth, we don't have to live in fear. God also makes another promise to us that no matter how sinful we are, no matter how bad things get, he now has another way to handle that. But we're going to come back to that soon. So for now, his next big promise is to Abraham. And this time he says, I promise that I will make Abraham into a great nation, and his children will be as numerous as the stars. Parents, doesn't that sound fun? Kids, how about it? Thousands, millions of brothers and sisters. Luckily for us, God doesn't mean one physical family. For Abraham, it may have meant that, and his descendants did form the nation of Israel. From those descendants, we even got a king. But again, we're going to come back to that a little bit later. For us, we read in the New Testament that we can be a part of that chosen family as well. For us to be a part of that, all we need to have is faith. And we talked about that last week. We need to have faith in God and his promises, and we need to believe in his greatest promise. But we move on from here to the third of God's biggest promises to us. But this time he says, I promise to bless you if you follow my laws. And you know, the laws that we're talking about here are the laws that God gave to Moses for Israel to follow. These laws would make Israel different from other nations at the time. We know some of these laws as don't worship other gods, don't try to create your own gods, use God's name with respect, keep the Sabbath day to worship, honor your father and mother, don't kill, don't cheat, don't steal, don't lie, and don't be jealous of other people's things. Most of these are pretty common for us today, but you know, for Israel, these laws made them a very different people. When they followed those laws, God promised he would bless them. But sometimes they didn't follow those laws. Sometimes we don't either. Honor your father and mother, for example. Anyone ever broken that one? Well, God knows that we make mistakes. God gave the Israelites ways to be forgiven of their sins. It was, however, a little more difficult for the people of Israel to make amends for their mistakes. So eventually God decides that he needs to make a new promise to make it easy and accessible for everyone. But again, we'll come back to that. God's fourth big promise was made to David. And in this one, God says, I promise that from David's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on, there will come someone called a Messiah. And now we're getting closer to that big promise. God starts this promise by telling King David that his descendants would rule for a long time, that his family would be blessed for generations. But then God's promise starts to expand even from that already big promise. He starts telling David about a kingdom that would last forever. And we know that kingdoms on earth here, they rise and they fall. But God promises one that won't do that. He promises a throne and a kingdom that will never end. Which means we have arrived at God's greatest promise. His fifth major promise in the Bible, God tells us, this is the big one. Let's do that one more time. I promise that I will forgive your sin. I will cleanse you. I will give you that new start that you need. I will love you. And all of this will be done through Jesus Christ. This is the one that I kept saying we're coming back to. We're finally here. This is God's biggest promise of all. God is telling us that there is nothing we can do that will take us so far from Him that we can't come back. The most pure, the most perfect type of love is freely given to us. That is truly the greatest of all of God's promises, but don't just take my word for it. Let's see what the Apostle Paul has to say about this from Hebrews chapter 8, verses 6 through 13. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is exacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. This new covenant is so much better than every one that came before that it is ready to fade all of the other promises into the background. This is the one promise made to last for all time. Furthermore, this new covenant, this promise of forgiveness, it's completely free for us. Our only stipulation is that we turn our hearts to God, and through Jesus we can receive all of the benefits that this new covenant gives to us. But it wasn't free for everyone. In the coming weeks, we'll be focusing more and more on the price that Jesus paid on the cross so that we could have all this. One more thought on promises before I wrap up for the day. Promises mean nothing if they aren't made in good faith. If someone makes you a promise and they have little to no intention of following through, what good was the promise in the first place? There was a 16-year-old boy who was getting into the idea of lifting weights. One day his dad took him to a sporting goods store, and they were walking around shopping at the weightlifting sets that they had for sale. Finally, one caught the boy's eye. "Please, Dad, this is the one that I want. I really want it. I promise I'll use them every day," he told his father. His dad wasn't convinced. "I don't know. These are a little more than I was ready to spend today." The son continued to plead, I'll use them every day. I really will. I promise." Still, his dad said, "Son, that's a big commitment. Doing something every day isn't easy to follow through on." "I know, Dad, but I really will. I promise," he told his dad a third time. So his dad finally relented. As they were walking to the front of the store, the dad paid for the set of weights, and then the dad started to walk out of the store. "Wait," called the son from behind him. "You mean I'm supposed to carry these out to the car by myself?" Promises made without an honest intention of keeping them usually don't last very long. But you can rest assured that God makes his promises with every intention of following through. For Noah, we continue to see rainbows in the sky to this day. We have never had another of those total, life-ending global disasters. Abraham did indeed become a father of a great nation. From him were born the 12 tribes of Israel, and even beyond that, anyone who counts themselves faithful to God is part of that spiritual family. In the law God gave to Moses and its application to the Israelites, we see him throughout the Old Testament, blessing his chosen people when they decided to keep to his law, but turning away from them when they don't. And then God promised to bring Daniel's house strong relatives, strong descendants for generations, and that an eventual Messiah would come from him. And sure enough, Jesus came to us from the lineage of David. And finally, God's greatest promise, a new covenant in that very same Jesus, that we are never too far away, that we are never too far gone, that we always have a God who wants us back. We always have a God who wants to forgive us, who wants us to return to him. And that is still a promise God is keeping to this very day. And all of God's people said,